In my mid-30s, I went back to grad school to get my Master's of Divinity. I then went on to become a pastor for the next 15 years, and now I am leaving Christianity. What happened? Let me start with talking about what kind of Christianity I left, because it wasn't just your standard traditional Christianity. It was one that was informed from my studies in cultural anthropology and social linguistics that really identified a Jesus that was much more of a political figure. You know, when we would use the terms Lord of Lords, King of Kings, Savior of the world, you know, these are all terms that we commonly think of within the Christian community as applying to Jesus. But at Jesus' time frame, those were all already in use for Caesar. So you, right from the beginning, have this radical political challenge that's going on. Jesus is officially executed for being king of the Jews. The beginning of his life is an existing king who's threatened by the birth of this new king. So there's all this political aspects to what we're going on. But there was a lot more than just that. So as much as I appreciated and engaged with the questions about how do we create a just and harmonious society, how do we watch out for those who are most at risk, most marginalized, the widows, the orphans, the poor, there was still a number of other issues that were very disturbing, not just to me, but to a lot of people. And, you know, some basic ones, you know, if we talk about scientific perspectives on things, the idea that the earth was flat, that it was on pillars covered by a dome, that the sun, moon, and stars were inside the dome, these were very problematic. But, you know, these were dealt with 500 years ago, and most of us have dealt with the fact that the Bible just didn't have that right. How did we do that, though? We mostly thought of it as, well, this was just a product of the cultural time frame that didn't really have an impact on the core message and was necessary to communicate in that time and place. So some of the other areas that I continued to have issues with were, you know, what do we do with the fact that there's violence, especially things like genocide? What do we do with what happens in terms of women being treated basically like property, and the fact that homosexuality is apparently condemned, or the fact that slavery is never condemned? These were all really challenging issues for me. Now, my background in biblical studies that I really focused on, as well as cultural anthropology, at least to the degree that it had an impact on biblical studies, had a big impact on how I looked at these things. I was able to see where the historical cultural context for these things fit. And much like the flat earth, these became what I call cultural artifacts, things that were in the Bible but not necessarily central to its message, but just part of how it was understood at that time. But what started to happen for me was more and more and more of the Bible was ending up being these cultural artifacts. And that was a bit of a challenge. And then as I continued in my intellectual pursuits, I became very interested in neuroscience and physics. And the more I started to understand the Standard Model and quantum wave theory, quantum field theory, there was less of a need to come up with explanations for why things happen. The needs for having some type of divine intervention started to shrink. The possibility for how would miracles function, how would they actually engage in the physical world, became more problematic. And eventually for me, the concept of miracles in general just really ceased to be something that was a possibility. And if there is a God, I'm not saying that there is not, it doesn't appear that it's the same kind of God that's described within the Christian Bible. So for those reasons, I really started to move away from having more of a traditional Christian perspective, in the sense that there is a divine being that interacts in our world based off of petitionary prayer. That doesn't mean that I'm not still fond of what Jesus taught and what he did, his social movements, how he engaged with the powers that be, how there was concern for those who were most marginalized. So I'm not anti-Christian, and I still participate in Christian community. I just don't believe what typical Christians believe anymore. And that's been hard. You invest your time, your resources into going back to graduate school, and a Master's of Divinity is not a simple program. It's 90 units, so it's a fair amount of work and commitment for both myself but also my family. And so walking away from that, how friends and family were going to look at, what are you doing? What do you believe now? The concerns about my salvation are all very challenging. In fact, there's probably going to be a fair number of people who discover this about me for the first time in this video. So I hope this isn't too disturbing or shocking, but I would just say my quest from the beginning, the reason I went back to graduate school in the first place, was because I was concerned about what is the nature of reality? Who am I? What do we do with this thing about death, and what are its possibilities? And I was driven to need to know as much as I could about these. And this is why I went, literally back to school in my late 30s to graduate school to get that degree, to actually practice as a pastor, to be fully committed and engaged. So it's not that I am coming to these conclusions without thoroughly investigating. There's been a fair amount of investigation that's gone on. But my path is still consistent with wanting to know, who am I? Why are we here? What about death? And I am finding different kinds of answers now as I move into this next phase of my life called spiritual naturalism. Now, I'll just give you a basic definition here, and then in following episodes we can talk more about what that means. But naturalism is essentially a way of looking at the world that favors verifiable information. And so basically it's like a scientific worldview for the most part. And it refers to itself as naturalism as opposed to supernaturalism. Now, some naturalists will have more of a dogmatic stance that there definitely is no God and we need to abandon this whole craziness. I'm not at that point. I'm more of, this is where I'm at. I don't know everything. I'm open to the possibility that there's going to be things that I learn about and discover. And that's great. That's the way it should be. But naturalism then gives that basic framework, that basic orientation to how I'm looking at the world, and that's modified with spiritual. And you might think that spiritual is really kind of contradictory. If we're saying that there is no supernatural, that there's just the natural, then where does spirit fit in? Well, spirit as a word really just, in its origins, just means breath. And it signifies life. So the idea of spirit is, it is all about what animates us, what gives us vitality. And so a person who is concerned about spiritual matters is somebody who's concerned about life. And so a spiritual naturalist is someone who can be very interested in diving into the depths and mysteries of what life is and what does it mean to be here now, just without all the supernatural trappings that come with more traditional religion. So that's where I'm at the moment, and we can dive into some more details in future episodes if you're interested in how I was working at solving some of the problems within Christianity about violence or women or slavery or so forth. If you're interested in those things, please let me know in the comments. And we will continue our discussion about what spiritual naturalism looks like and how I am now incorporating that into my life and getting a sense of meaning and purpose. All right, be well, everyone.